Buckskin Girl and Blackheart. I'll read an excerpt from chapter 1. Maybe it was predestined from the beginning. I did not come easy into this world, but easier than my mother had parted from it. Mine was, as they call it now, a breech birth, which for those unfamiliar with childbearing means that I came out feet first in a scene messier and more fraught with complication than your everyday birthing, particularly in 1907. Had she been anywhere near a hospital or even had the services of a visiting physician, my mother may have had a chance at survival. Instead, she bled to death on her bed as the two labor ladies, summoned her help in the affair, labored in helpless horror to stave the hemorrhaging with blood-soaked towels and bed sheets. From what I was told at a far too early age, my father simply walked out of the bedroom, cursing at my very existence and refusing to hold me, even for those brief moments as my mother clung desperately to life. He didn't bother making the effort to name me. That fell on our neighbor lady, Bessie Upton, who had taken part in the fiasco. She was the closest person to a friend my mother had, living in that isolated little patch of nothingness in a forested valley that gave little back except solitude to its few occupants. I was to be Rebecca Sarah after my grandmother's and mother's first names. My earliest recollections were those of Bessie and her rough-hewn husband Arnold in their tiny, crude, unpainted shack 50 yards further into the bush from our own slightly larger clapboard cabin. Bessie, always in a cotton print dress and apron, was all no nonsense, except when it came to me. She had at least 40 pounds on a perpetually unshaven Arnold, whose heavy logger's pants always seemed too big in the waist and needed the wide red suspenders to hold them up. But they were both kindly, and for the first years of my life, they were all I had. Father was seldom home, and when he was, he often smelled of a disgusting mix of body odor, cigarettes, and stale liquor. I don't know what arrangements he'd made with the Uptons, if any at all, but they provided the closest thing to a home I could ever recall in those years. They were caring and warm in their own way, but were certainly not prone to overt displays of affection. Bessie seemed busy all the time, as if the workload was endless for two people living in a two-room shack in the middle of nowhere. She'd serve meals up to Arnold and me, then eat later by herself. I always found that strange, particularly as I grew a bit older. They never touched, nor kissed, or anything like that. But what did I know at that age? Maybe that's just how adults were with one another after years of being together. Strangely, I knew it wasn't Arnold. From time to time, he would lift me onto his lap, then jog me, straddled on his knee, as I held onto his fingers like they were reins, as he made horsey sounds and made me giggle. Years later, when I thought back on it, it struck me that I was probably filled an emptiness in his life. In those early years, I can't ever recall my father using my given name. It was always kid or less. Yet, if he was barking out commands to me, the order always began with a sharp, "Hey!" to get my attention. "Hey, get to bed. Hey, take your coat and get over to the Uptons. Hey, don't give me that look and stop your blubbering." Not once do I recall anything even remotely resembling a conversation in those years. But as absent as he was still my father, and I was ready to grab onto anything that even vaguely resembled normalcy. I remember it so clearly, even now. One day, just out of the blue, he called me my little buckskin girl. I don't know why he did, and it had not been done with any sort of affection. But to me it sounded nice. It was like he acknowledged me as someone, a person. And at the tender age of 5, I had the good sense not to ruin things by asking him why. Maybe Bessie might know, I thought. I don't have a clue, hon. Maybe it's because of your beautiful tan skin from playing outside all the time. Perhaps your dad just noticed it and it reminded him of a doe deer. At 5 I was okay with that answer, and I decided that if that was the name my father had chosen for me, that was the one I was going to use myself. And I said goodbye to Rebecca and Sarah. Little did I know that it was going to get me into some difficulties when I got to school, which wasn't terribly far off. In the meantime, though, I was able to convince the Uptons that they should henceforth refer to me as Buckskin. Arnold tried Buck on me a few times, but my look of disdain when he called me that persuaded him Buckskin was the better choice. Somehow, Buck had too much of a masculine ring to it. As I grew older, I accepted that this shortened ring was okay. After all, living where we were, it was impossible not to become somewhat of a tomboy. Even at the age of 5, however, I was aware of my femininity. Bessie was helping with that from day one, making sure I often wore dresses rather than trousers, and played with dolls and tea sets that she pulled from an old trunk in her shed out back. The rag stuffed cloth dolls smelled the musty odor of dampness from long-time storage, but I was fine with that. Their doll dresses in bright checks, polka dots, and flower prints were pretty. Bessie even had an old wicker toy doll carriage that she gave me, and I spent hours strolling between her place and ours with a carriage full of my girls. In the late summer of that year, before I was to start school, my father took terribly ill and was close to joining our mother in the hereafter. I don't know what it was, but Bessie was preparing me for the worst. And though my relationship with him was next to non-existent, I felt a fear of loss that I couldn't grasp. Fortunately, the ancient doctor that tended to the folks in our corner of the world was making one of his all too frequent rounds and showed up at our shack just about the time Arnold was gathering up rough lumber to build a coffin. Dr. Stafford tended to Father for the better part of the day, swabbing him down with cold, wet cloths and giving him an injection with a needle so huge it scares me to this day when I think about it. He left behind a small bottle of medicine that smelled absolutely revolting, with the instructions to give him a spoonful 3 times a day. Something worked. Father began a slow recovery. Bessie brought over food and chicken broth every day, and the color began to seep back into his face. Something else had changed too. He no longer stank of rancid body odor, alcohol, and cigarettes. That was due to a combination of doctor's orders and the lack of finances, since Father had been unable to work as a contract logger. There was no unemployment insurance back in those days, so we survived on the goodwill of a few friends and neighbors, who themselves were not that well off. Whether it was his brush with death, I can't say, nor did the why of it cross my mind. but as his health returned, my father became a real father. He was almost fully recovered now, but still quite weak, and Bessie charged me with the responsibility of spooning the broth she prepared for him as he lay propped up in bed. As I sat next to the cot that Arnold had set up in the kitchen near the stove, I looked into his face, perhaps for the very first time ever. He was silently looking straight back at me, and tears were streaming down his cheek. "I'm sorry, Buckskin," he whispered gently, closing his eyes tightly to stave the flow of tears.